Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Bradley and today we will be talking about the integumentary system. To start off, we are just really continuing on our last chapter when we talked about the four different types of tissues found in the human body. The four, just to remind you, would be epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and then nervous tissue. And when we consider the integumentary system, which is really just our skin, it falls under being primarily made up of epithelial tissue. And thus, it's considered to be an epithelial membrane. So when we look at membranes, membranes are any type of covering or lining of our body and body organs. And so there's multiple different types of membranes, and we'll see them as we talk more about other systems. But today we are just focusing on the cutaneous epithelial membrane, which is the skin. So overall, our functions of the skin would be to really protect. That is the main function. Protect against any type of environmental negative effects like wear and tear, any type of UV radiation, keeps our internal organs from drying out because it just creates this barrier between us and the environment. The integumentary system also helps with the retention of heat, and it will work with the nervous system for that. This is one of the reasons why if we get cold, we shiver, and sometimes when we're cold, we also get goosebumps. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we get into some of the accessory structures of the skin. Um, the skin also helps to get rid of waste products, metabolic waste products of some of our cells that are located in this system, and that's through sweat glands and the production of sweat and the excretion of sweat through our sweat pores onto the surface of the skin. So sweat is not just water, it contains other materials like uric acid, which is, again, a metabolic byproduct of just day-to-day cell processes. And then finally, our skin helps with the synthesis of vitamin D. So aside from, maybe drinking a lot of milk, we can't actually take vitamin D from our diet and readily use it. We have to really take that molecule and manipulate it, and it's within the skin, and the ability to use UV radiation to help with that process. And so really this is where we make vitamin D useful within the body. And really the structures that we'll be studying will be the epidermis, which is the outermost layer, the dermis, and then the subcutaneous layer. And then we'll also be looking at some skin appendages, which would be structures that are accessory and that help the skin to complete its overall four functions. So let's move on to the epidermis. Okay, the epidermis, just generically speaking, is made up of epithelial tissue, specifically that stratified squamous epithelium. Remember, those cells are really flattened, scale-like, look like pancake type cells, and they are stacked very, very closely together. Now, the epidermis has the ability to produce proteins that are very, very strong that allow for durability and prevent any type of wear and tear. And that protein that I'm referring to is keratin. And so we say that these cells have keratinizing ability because they are classified as keratinocytes, meaning they will produce keratin and allow for the keratin to fill up inside. And as these cells age, they eventually will go through a process where the keratin protein is so overwhelming inside of the cell that it will kill the cell as it reaches its lifespan, but that's towards the outside of our skin. And so if we look at the very top layers of our skin, what we can see, those cells are no longer living. They are actually dead cells, and they provide scale-like ability for us. The epidermis is avascular, meaning there's no direct blood flow to this, and so these cells that are in fact living, for the most part on the bottom portion of the epidermis, they will receive all nutrients through diffusion from the capillaries that reach up into the dermis. And also when we look at the epidermis, it can vary in how thin or how thick it is depending on where we're looking at on the body. So, when we consider areas on the body that endure a lot of wear and tear, like the palms of our hands, because we're always grabbing things, we're always picking things up, we're always using our hands. Sometimes our hands can become almost callus-like. And then also the soles of our feet, which we're always standing, we're always walking, we're always moving, and we always use our feet to do that. These areas will have the thickest of skin. And of course, in those areas, there aren't any hair, whereas on the other portions of our body, we will find that it is hair containing skin and it's thinner. So here are the 5 layers of the epidermis. I have them listed starting from the bottommost layer. So we can see that number 1 is the bottommost layer. And if you look on the diagram, you can see how these layers are separated. Again, if you find the bottommost layer of the epidermis, it's the stratum basale. This is where you see a lot of very healthy looking cells. They have very dark stained nuclei. This is an active site of cell division. This is where all of our new skin originates from. Also, in between these squamous cells that make up the epidermis, we have specialized melanocyte cells that will produce melanin, which gives us our skin pigment. And it also allows for tanning to occur when we're exposed to UV radiation during sun or, tanning booths or, whatever it is that might cause tanning. Now, the next couple of layers, there are not a lot of characteristics that make them really stand out and really important for us to discuss at this level. The stratum spinosum, it sits on top of the stratum basale. Stratum granulosum sits on top of the stratum spinosum, and these are just some intermediate layers. Now, the stratum lucidum, that I have in parentheses because that is that layer that is only found in the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. So that is the only layer that we see in those areas right there of thick skin. And this is also the start of our dead cells. This layer means that as these cells originate in the stratum basale and are dividing as they age, they get pushed up towards the very top of the epidermis just because the stratum basale is continuously having cells divide. And as other cells divide, they push up. And so as these cells get further and further away from the capillaries of the dermis, they actually begin to die. And as they die, because they're so far away from the ability for these nutrients to diffuse, we see that they also become fully keratinized, meaning these cells are producing keratin and they become very tough and scale-like. And then finally, our topmost layer of skin, which you can see is, a relatively thick sort of layer, that is the stratum corneum. And that layer is completely made up of fully keratinized, non-living cells that the only reason why we have them there is that it provides mechanical and chemical protection. These cells are scale-like and, they just provide that protection that the skin offers. Moving on, we have the dermis. The dermis is our second sublayer of the skin, sits underneath the epidermis, and it can also vary in thickness depending on the location of the human body. This right here, this is where we find a lot of the accessory structures, and the dermis is actually made up of dense fibrous connective tissue. So that means that there are a lot of protein type structures that keep everything together. And so when we look at the dermis, it can be divided into 2 sublayers. We have the papillary layer, which is it's the smaller of the 2 layers and it sits directly underneath the epidermis. This is what gives us, our ridges and grooves of our skin, because if we look at our skin very closely, it's not smooth. There's ridges and grooves, and actually on our fingertips, it can give us, our unique fingerprints that we all have. This is also where we have free nerve endings, which will sense pain, and we have what's called the Meissner's corpuscle, which senses touch. Now, the second sublayer of the dermis is the reticular layer. This is where all of the blood vessels are, and so those blood vessels will run, right underneath the epidermis, and the capillaries that extend off into them go up into the dermal papillae of the papillary layer. And so that's where we see, those nutrients diffusing up into that stratum basal of the bottommost layer for the epidermis. Now, also found in the reticular layer will be our various glands. We have sweat glands and oil glands. We'll see that we have an additional sense receptor called the Pacinian corpuscle, which senses deep pressure. Now, that's different from touch because the Meissner's corpuscle could, just feel like a light brush or a light touch, like as if a feather was just touching your skin. Whereas if somebody was grabbing onto your arm, or, if you press your arm against, maybe the desk, that deep pressure sense is the Pacinian corpuscle. This is where we see phagocytes, which are special white blood cells that are able to move through all of these tissues, and they act as like a search and destroy type cell, making sure that there's no bacteria or other invasive type materials. And when they do come across anything like that, they will engulf it, eat it, digest it, and thus destroying it. And then finally, we find that the reticular layer will be primarily made up of that collagen and elastic fibers that you would associate with the dense fibrous connective tissue. And then finally, to finish up our introduction to the skin and its few layers, is the subcutaneous layer. This sits underneath the dermis and actually sits right on top of all of our skeletal muscles. It's primarily made of adipose tissue. This is where we see heat retention. This is where we see body insulation. And it also allows for anchoring of the skin to the muscles. So this is almost like that layer that provides a glue-like ability to keep our skin nice and taut to the rest of the body. And so that's where we're going to end our notes for today. That's the three general layers of the integumentary system. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get a hold of me. Thank you.